The horrific historical photos from the Cuban force during the Spanish-American War will leave you shocked. In this video, today, we'll be looking at some of the most horrific historical photos from the Cuban force during the Spanish-American War that will leave you shocked. Some of these images are not for the faint-hearted, severe discretion is advised. So, let's get straight into the video. Background. The Spanish-American War took place between April and August of 1898. The war began as a result of the Cuban War of Independence, which had been raging since 1868. The United States had been following the events in Cuba closely and had become increasingly concerned about the situation. In February 1898, a U.S. battleship exploded in the harbor of Havana, Cuba. The explosion killed 266 American sailors and was blamed on the Spanish government. This event served as a catalyst for the United States to declare war on Spain. The Cuban force played a crucial role in the conflict. They fought fiercely against the Spanish army, using unconventional tactics such as ambushes and hit-and-run attacks. The Cuban force was supported by the United States, which sent troops and supplies to aid the rebels. The photos. Number 1. Let's start with this first photo of a Cuban guerrilla fighter who was captured by the Spanish army. As you can see, he's tied up and blindfolded, awaiting his execution. This was a common practice during the war, and it's estimated that tens of thousands of Cubans were killed by the Spanish army. The Spanish army had a policy of killing Cuban fighters on the spot if they were captured. This was done to intimidate the rebels and to prevent them from being used as propaganda by the Cuban government. The policy was also used to avoid having to feed and care for prisoners of war, which was seen as a burden on the Spanish army. Number 2. Moving on, we have this photo of a group of Cuban revolutionaries. This image was taken in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where the revolutionaries held out against the Spanish army. The Cuban revolutionaries were led by a young lawyer named Fidel Castro, who would later become the leader of Cuba. The rebels were able to hold out in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they established a base of operations. From there, they launched attacks on Spanish forces and disrupted supply lines. The guerrilla tactics used by the Cuban force proved to be effective, and they were able to weaken the Spanish army. Next up, we have this photo of a Cuban family who was displaced by the war. They're standing in front of the destroyed home, which was burned down by the Spanish army. Civilians were caught in the crossfire during the Spanish-American War, and many were forced to flee their homes. The Spanish army employed a scorched earth policy, which involved burning villages and crops to deprive the rebels of resources. This policy had devastating consequences for the civilian population, who were left without homes or food. Number 4. Moving on, we have this photo of a Cuban soldier who was wounded in battle. The soldier was lucky enough to be treated by a medical team, but many others were left to die on the battlefield. The Cuban force had a difficult time getting access to medical supplies and personnel during the war. This meant that many soldiers who were wounded had to rely on their comrades for care, and they often died from infections or other complications. Despite this, the Cuban soldiers remained resilient and continued to fight for their cause. Number 6. Finally, we have this photo of a group of Cuban soldiers who were captured by the Spanish army. The image shows the defeat and humiliation of the Cuban force, who were ultimately unsuccessful in their fight for independence. The Spanish-American War ended in August 1898 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The treaty granted Cuba independence from Spain, but it also gave the United States control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Despite this, the Cuban people were overjoyed at their newfound freedom, and they celebrated the end of war with parades and festivals. In conclusion, these images serve as a reminder of the brutal realities of war and the sacrifices that soldiers and civilians make in the fight for freedom. What do you think about these photos? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.